I'm going to touch on two things here, and really in doing this, I do hope to stimulate your interest in your questions and to have discussion around these things. So I'll try not to talk for too long so that we have good time for that. And it's really the message now coming out with we have the Biodiversity Convention next year, which I engage with a lot from a coral reef and a science point of view, and the climate COP in just a month's time, almost, just a bit more than that in Glasgow, is that we're understanding how close to planetary limits we're approaching for the health of biodiversity. But it's not just at planetary scales, it's at local scales as well. And a big issue is to really get countries, cities, communities, companies, people to understand how much of a foundation biodiversity is for so much of what we do. So I'll head straight into that. My region is the Western Indian Ocean, or East Africa, shown in the map over here, and I'm based in Kenya on the coast. But really, the coral reef systems across this whole coastline are really quite a consistent biogeographic region. It's a very rich area for biodiversity, very important for fisheries and supporting people locally. Now, I'll go straight into the Sustainable Development Goals, because this is, it's very dry international language that has been pulled together. There are these 17 goals that have been identified through the United Nations, and the countries have agreed to them, almost all countries around the world. So they're like a common language. You can think of them as 17 basic principles, inalienable rights, perhaps, that we need to address to be sustainable. And so the one that I tend to deal with is goal 14, life below water, and you can see it there in the bottom row. But the frustrating thing about these goals is that this rectangle of boxes and bright colors doesn't really speak to people very easily in many ways. And we're trying to look for ways to really make it that much more accessible. There are a number of different other ways to depict the goals, like this circle of icons arranged all the way around the top from 1 to 17, going around the face of a clock. And as scientists, we like to draw links and lines between them to show relationships. But in this case, I thought why don't we look at a place through the Sustainable Development Goals, through the SDGs, and look at this as a coastal village in Tanzania, in fact. But you could look at your own environment. You could look at the landscapes around Henley in the same way to build up a story. So the story goes like this. Now, at the bottom, we have nature. In this case, there are 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals relate to nature or natural capital. And you can start a narrative around a local place or a general one. So the health of the ocean, and that's in goal 14, and coastal assets, that's in goal 6 for fresh water and 15 for land. These are moderated by climate interactions. And of course, we're all thinking about climate change now. Now, these generate ecosystem services. And these services support direct benefits. And this is the economies that we all live and work by, and our companies produce goods and services related to these. So these services support income and jobs across multiple economic sectors. That's goal 8. Through extraction and use of resources. That's goal 12. Providing infrastructure for innovation, goal 9. Potential energy solutions, goal 7. And growing coastal communities and cities. And these direct benefits then essentially provide for welfare in society, the indirect benefits that are contained in these other 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So they contribute to reducing poverty and hunger in goal 1 and 2, improve health in goal 3, and strengthen gender and social equity in goals 5 and 10. And all of these are held together through the means that we use to run society. So the governance institutions and mechanisms in goal 16, the investments and finance and participation of all groups of society, and that's really in goal 17, and all informed by awareness and knowledge. And what this has done is it's taken that sort of dry rectangle of the Sustainable Development Goals and put them into more of a narrative format. I've aligned this around the ocean for a blue economy narrative, but you could do it for green economic development on land, for example. Okay, so it's still a bit dry, I think. It's a bit of an abstract model. So the next step that I thought to communicate this is, why not try and describe a local place, like a coral reef fishing community on the coast of Kenya? So if we start at the bottom over here, we have a couple, a fisherman called Hamisi and his wife, Mariam. She sells fish in the market 3 to 4 times a week, as well as farming and doing all jobs that women do, of course. But their joint income pays for their children's school fees, and medical needs, house, transport, and so on. And you can link all these parts of their life or their household economy to these different sustainable development goals pictured over here. So besides Hamisi, there's number 1, that's reducing poverty, and that's the income. And 8 is the job that he has as a fisherman. 12 is the sustainable or how he fishes. So you can really link these goals to people's individual lives. Now, all that they have is dependent on the reef system that's adjacent to them in goal 14. So this coral reef is used by fishermen. It's used for local tourism. It's managed by what we call a beach management unit over here, BMU. But pressure is high and the fish are becoming depleted. Now, this beach management unit is a local community organization that now under Kenyan legislation has a role to manage their part of the ocean and the reefs together with the fisheries department. There's a gender element with 30% representation of women in all Kenyan public institutions. There has to be, which Mariam's mother is a part of. But this beach management unit also protects part of the reef area. Under Goal 16, they have their rules and bylaws and so on, through which they regulate who fishes where and how. Now, this reef is also an attraction for tourism, and a resort town has grown in this reef area over the last 10 or 20 years. Of course, it has impacts through land use, water and pollution, and demand for seafood. And again, there are a range of the sustainable development goals related to that tourism development. There's a number of businesses have grown in the area around the reef. So the local tourism operators, there's some NGOs who have come into the area to help with reef conservation and awareness. There's a lot of researchers involved in the area. And so there's a lot of partnerships that have developed around this reef and what it provides to people. An extra wrinkle bringing in the education goal is that Hamisi and Mariam's son has studied at college, and he's an electrician and is working in the local area. But he started a cold store business with his family, so he can market fish from the fishing community to hotels and restaurants and build up their income that way. Of course, climate change and energy use have an impact in the area, both through what happens globally, but also the tourists that come to the area and their climate footprint. And the local tourism industry is interested in sustainability and has undertaken some projects to try and reduce their carbon footprint. All of this is governed, of course, through the local government and national government that has overall authority around these interest groups and the various relationships shown by arrows. And then in the center of it all is these three key goals of the SDGs around equality. So gender equality, equality amongst groups of people, and then also the laws and the governance institutions that regulate this place. So here we've built up a narrative model of the SDGs, but for a local fishing area. And it's in very accessible terms for everybody to understand. And this long story is intended to bring you back to the reef itself, to the biodiversity. And this is the icon for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And to understand that all of this wealth, all of the benefits are generated in this area, even from the high-end tourism development and the restaurants, and maybe there's art galleries there now as well. All of these things lean on the ecosystem, the environment being healthy and being able to sustain it itself. So this slide just points you to, I'd love you to go to this website when you can afterwards, currentconservation.org. It's an Indian online conservation journal, and they have a range of writers writing about various topics. And they reached out to me to write this article. And I love the idea of it because they also invest in these illustrations. And rather than just having the dry science about trying to explain what the Sustainable Development Goals are and the role of biodiversity, there's a chance here to write a piece that would have, beautiful illustrations that could really draw people into the story and see and make it much more accessible to the public. So please do go and have a look at that when you can. It just came out, I think, last week, and it's on the issues on their front page. So what does all this do? So if I just come back to this picture and the perspective that many of us as biodiversity scientists have, I focus on life in the sea, and as Jeremy mentioned, there are so many disciplines around biodiversity. We're each talking our technical language, trying to convince everybody of what should happen, what we should protect, and why, and so on. But it's not accessible to most people. And so the key thing here, I think, is that the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is one of the global conventions that we have alongside the Biodiversity Convention, it really provides us a way to understand a local area from the perspective of different stakeholders. So here I've put around the goal circle the different institutions that you might have. So, for example, in local government in your own area, there are those goals that relate to biodiversity, but there are institutions or departments that relate to climate and how you're adapting to climate. There's considerations about farming and production, about the cities and towns and urban development, rights and equality, going all the way around the circle. So you can find stakeholder groups and departments or governments, local and national government institutions in all of these areas. And the intent of these Sustainable Development Goals is really to help align all of these visions together. So I've put here the perspective that I have from life in the sea on the left. And one we've become familiar with now in the last year is, because of COVID crisis, is the One Health perspective from the upper right there. But the idea is that if we all have the same overall vision of sustainable development and of sustaining biodiversity because of its importance to us and its own values, we will come up with consistent solutions across all these different areas. They won't necessarily be fighting or antagonistic with one another. One group pushing for this, another group pushing for something else. But with common goals like this, we can really all align and work together around the same thing. So coming to the Biodiversity Convention, because I was really pleased to be invited to talk about this now, because as we know, there's so much focus on the Climate Convention next month, and the climate community, in a way, is a lot more powerful than the biodiversity one because of the impact of climate change on our lives suddenly. Now, the Biodiversity Convention, it's complicated. The convention has 3 objectives, with this GBF is the new biodiversity framework, global biodiversity framework we're all negotiating, and it has 4 goals and then 21 targets under that. And it's just really complicated to try and blend all of this together. And in an effort to contribute our voice on this, so I led this paper which came out in the middle of August with a group of African writers. And the thing that we are really trying to get across in all this discussion around biodiversity conservation is the importance of nature to people. Of course, nature is important in its own right, and biodiversity is, and we can't, we won't survive if we don't maintain it well in big protected areas around the planet, that can really do all the carbon sequestration that we need and produce oxygen and all sorts of things like that. But in Africa, and in most places where most people live. So again, I'll sort of put this to you as well in your local area around Henley. We live not in the most intact areas. So these graphs show from this group that I was meeting with when I met Jeremy. So, these graphs show the state of land and ocean across the planet. So on the left are all the intact areas where there's no footprint of humanity. And then you go across to 100%, and that's on the right is the really highly altered systems, or the anthromes, we call them, anthropogenically impacted biomes. Now, and those are cities and intensive agriculture areas. But most people on land live in these shared spaces between the intact and the fully impacted. And in those spaces, we have our farms, we live our lives, and we interact with biodiversity, and it sustains us. And it's the same in the sea with fisheries areas and so on, and coastal areas, is that because most people live in these shared spaces, we really need biodiversity conservation to work for people, to sustain their livelihoods, especially in places where there are high levels of poverty. And so this is really a motivation to work to shift the perspective of the conservation community and the donors and so on, from just thinking about, we need to protect biodiversity in the Amazon or in the high sea or in these, really remote, unpopulated places, to really think about the places where people live. So I've got a couple of graphs here that might be a bit dry, but what this tries to illustrate is where we are now with conservation on land. So under one of the biodiversity targets that just expired in 2020, HE Target 11, it's called, the world committed to protect 17% of land under protected areas. And generally, the effort puts these all in the most intact or the high priority biodiversity areas. So on the left of this graph, you get that 17% that's been designated as protected. It's not necessarily effectively protected, but we did reach that target, and the rest is another discussion. But there are challenges with it, which I'll come back to in a moment. And let me give you from that graph. Ignore the text on the right. I'll go to the next graph, which builds on this figure. So we had that 17% on the left of that area, and that's the high protection areas that we already have under HE Target 11, that is, in 2020. Now, rather than build up now the new targets, which we will have accepted in China next year, will likely have a new target of increasing to 30%. And I've shown those light gray bars, above the dark green one, and to the right up to 30% on the x-axis. Rather than put all that effort into the next most remote or intact places, and there's a lot of challenges with that, because there are people living in those areas, and they're concerned that more protection will mean less rights for them, and who's in charge and things like that, and where are those areas anyway, and being decided by scientists. Rather than putting all the effort over there, we need to spread that effort. So across those green bars or columns along the x-axis, to spread that effort that's gray into those green columns, into these shared spaces on Earth and on land and in the sea. And it turns out, if you do the math, if you do it 20% of those areas, and then some amount in cities as well, I won't talk about that part, but we can in the questions if you like. All of this could add up to the 30% as a global target. Now, the reason for doing this is there are 4 pillars to this approach. So the first is a lot of biodiversity work is prioritized from the global scale. Where are the most important areas globally? And we want to switch that around to focus at the local scale. And the reason for that is also to focus on people's needs and equity, where people are living. So if there's going to be conservation in an area, then people living there need to have a strong say in what happens and how and where. And the challenge then doing this is we bring all the knowledge that we have in science, which is phenomenal. But now we have phenomenal tools to be able to do this. We can bring all this knowledge down to the local scale, and we can blend it with the local and traditional knowledge that people have on the ground. And so you can really mix the knowledge systems and try and, use the science that says, well, we need to protect, part of this area because this is where an endangered species lives, and the local communities and stakeholders and villagers and people from the neighboring towns can say, yes, okay, that's great, and we'll do our farming over here, and we'll make it balance out. And you address all the relevant targets at this level. So this 30% target was 17% before, is just one of the targets out of 21 that need to be met. So we want to not just focus on the area, but consider all of them together. And this magic 20% number came from a study recently that says if you have intact vegetation or intact natural habitat at 20% of any local area, you can really do effective biodiversity conservation, and you provide benefits to people. And this is very much akin to, in the English countryside, to your woods, to the hedgerows and so on that you have in farmland and so on. All of these can count towards this biodiversity conservation that also is there and helps people lead their lives. So I'll just finish up with this. And part of this is to show, I mentioned there are 21 targets, right? And this, so far, I've really focused just on this area one. And the area one makes it very inaccessible to a lot of people. And two examples I'll give. One is, within that basic model on the left, you could achieve that conservation in many different ways. And the graph in the middle shows some contribution of different governance regimes, we call them. So if you have areas controlled by local communities or indigenous peoples, if they're managing that, they can be in charge of that, and what they do can add up to the national target or the global target. There are other PAs or protected areas, the traditional protected areas. There's a big role for them, of course, playing a role, but they don't have to play the only role. And there are other designations. We're calling them other effective conservation measures. It's a very inaccessible term, but descriptive. We're trying to work out how can we make all of these different approaches count. And then a big thing is, of course, as you go out along that x-axis, how much do you have to restore nature? And we certainly have a big understanding that we won't achieve biodiversity conservation properly unless we restore nature in many places. And this helps show that as you do conservation in these more populated places out towards the right of the graph over here, you need a much larger contribution of restoration action to meet the protection targets and to sustain the biodiversity as well. So I think that's my last slide, I think, is just a summary of just putting a couple of these things and some links together for those of you that may be interested in looking into this some more. Otherwise, I just wanted to, then I'll stop my speech and open it up for discussion. I hope this was stimulating and links to some of what you're experiencing with landscapes and conservation where you live, not just out there in these wild places. So thank you.